I knew something was wrong before I even turned off the engine. You ever have that feeling where a place you've lived in for years suddenly doesn't feel like yours anymore? Yeah, that's what hit me the second I pulled into my driveway that Sunday night. The whole front side of my property looked naked, exposed, like somebody had peeled the skin off the land while I was gone. At first, I couldn't even process it. My brain kept trying to fill in what was supposed to be there. A solid wall of deep green cedar hedges, 12 feet high in some spots, thick enough to block headlights, noise, wind. Hell, they were the only reason I could drink coffee on my porch without staring directly into my neighbor's oversized kitchen windows every morning. But they were gone. Not trimmed, not damaged, gone. Completely ripped out of the ground like somebody declared war on landscaping. Fresh dirt stretched across the property line, roots torn apart, muddy tire tracks everywhere. And sitting over on the side near the fence was this rented mini bulldozer with half the clay from my yard still caked onto the blade. That's when I realized this wasn't some storm cleanup or HOA misunderstanding. Somebody did this on purpose. And deep down, before I even walked next door, I already knew exactly who it was. My neighbor, Grant Holloway. Grant was one of those guys who treated suburban life like he'd been elected mayor of the cul-de-sac. Perfect lawn stripes, spotless driveway, American flag changed out every season like clockwork. The kind of guy who'd smile at you during block parties while quietly reporting your trash cans to the HOA if they sat out too long. We'd never had a huge blowout or anything, but there was always tension, little comments here and there. Those hedges are getting pretty tall. Must be nice having all that privacy. Stuff like that. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation. Turns out, he'd been staring at those trees like they personally offended him for years. I walked straight across the lawn and into his open garage, tools everywhere, extension cords hanging down, classic weekend warrior setup. Grant stepped out wiping his hands on a rag like he'd just finished rebuilding a transmission or something. And I didn't yell. Honestly, that's the weird part. I was too stunned to yell. I just looked at him and said, "You tore out my hedges?" He didn't even hesitate. No guilt. No panic. Nothing. He just shrugged and goes, "They were overgrown." Like we were talking about weeds. I remember staring at him for a second waiting for the punchline. But this guy was dead serious. I said, "Those trees were 3 feet inside my property line." And this man, I swear to God, actually laughed under his breath before saying, "Well, half of them leaned into my yard anyway. Plus they looked terrible." Terrible. That word sat in my chest like gasoline vapor. Because right there, in one sentence, he told me exactly what this was really about. It wasn't safety. It wasn't property maintenance. It was control. Grant hated the fact that he couldn't fully see my property from his giant corner lot. He hated that the hedges interrupted his perfect suburban postcard view. And the second I left town for 2 days, he decided to fix the problem himself. This is a psychological trap a lot of entitled neighbors fall into. They convince themselves that proximity equals authority. If they have to look at something long enough, eventually they start believing they own the right to change it. And honestly, the craziest part? Grant genuinely thought I was just going to roll over and replace the trees with some cheap little shrubs from Home Depot. That became obvious about 30 seconds later when he crossed his arms and said, "Look, if you want, I'll chip in for some smaller bushes." Smaller bushes. Man, I almost laughed right there in his driveway. Because what Grant didn't understand yet was that those weren't bushes. Those were 20-year-old mature cedar privacy trees, professionally planted before I even bought the house. And replacing them wasn't going to cost hundreds. It was going to cost enough to ruin his entire summer. I looked at the bulldozer one more time, then back at him, and said the calmest thing I've ever said in my life. "You should have gotten a survey first." Then I turned around and walked back into my house while he stood there still thinking this was a landscaping disagreement, when in reality, he had just bulldozed himself directly into a property law nightmare. Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me explain something because this is where people completely misunderstand how property disputes actually work in America. Most folks think if something hangs over your yard, blocks your view, drops leaves, whatever, you can just remove it. Nope, not even close. According to standard procedure, property boundaries are king. Doesn't matter if you hate the color of your neighbor's house. Doesn't matter if their trees annoy you. If the trunk is rooted on their property, you touch it without permission, and suddenly you're not dealing with landscaping anymore. You're dealing with destruction of property. And mature trees? Oh man, Those are a whole different category financially. Courts don't price them like little garden center plants. They look at replacement value, age, growth time, installation costs, environmental impact, sometimes even loss of privacy and property value. That's where people get blindsided. From a legal perspective, Grant made the worst possible mistake an aggressive neighbor can make. He acted first and assumed confidence would replace paperwork. Guys like him rely on intimidation psychology. They think if they sound certain enough, those trees were ugly. They leaned into my yard. Everybody knew they were a problem. Then reality somehow bends around their opinion. It doesn't. Surveys beat opinions every single time. And this is a psychological trap suburban control freaks fall into constantly. They confuse irritation with ownership. The longer something bothers them, the more entitled they feel to remove it themselves. But neighborhoods don't run on feelings, they run on documentation. Property maps, permits, easements, city ordinances, that's the real game. And Grant had no idea yet. But the second I pulled my closing documents out of that filing cabinet, his little weekend bulldozer project officially became expensive. So the next morning, before the sun was even fully up, I had my closing paperwork spread across the kitchen table with a cup of burnt coffee sitting next to me, flipping through survey maps like I was prepping for a murder trial. And there it was, clear as day. The original cedar line sat 36 inches inside my property boundary the entire length of the yard. Not close. Not debatable. Measured down to the inch. Honestly, the second I saw that map, something inside me got real calm. Because anger is messy, proof is clean. By 9 a.m., I'd already hired a licensed surveyor. Grant apparently thought the whole thing was going to blow over because around lunchtime I saw him outside washing his truck like nothing happened, sunglasses on, country music playing from his garage speaker, living his best suburban dictator life. Then the survey crew showed up. 3 guys in neon safety vests started walking the property with tripods and measuring rods, while Grant slowly realized this situation might actually involve consequences. I'll never forget his face when those bright pink marker stakes started going into the ground. One after another, perfectly straight, every single one landing well inside where the trees had been standing. Grant walked over halfway through the process trying to act casual, but I could see the panic starting to creep into his voice. "That can't be right," he said, staring at the markers. The surveyor didn't even look up. Guy just said, "Sir, these coordinates match the county records exactly." That silence afterward? Beautiful. Grant kept staring at the dirt, like maybe reality would rearrange itself if he frowned hard enough. Finally he goes, "Fine. Send me a bill for some replacement shrubs." Shrubs. Again with the shrubs. That's when I realized he still didn't understand the scale of what he'd done. I said, "Grant, those were mature cedar privacy trees. They were over 20 years old." He shrugged and hit me with, "Trees grow back." Real smug too. Like he'd solved philosophy. So I decided to educate him. I called a landscaping company that specialized in mature tree relocation and high-end privacy installations. Not the guys selling baby bushes in plastic buckets out of a parking lot. I mean actual arborists with cranes and commercial transport rigs. 2 days later they came out, walked the entire property line, measured spacing, checked soil conditions, irrigation access, root depth, the works. One of the arborists actually whistled when he heard the original trees were ripped out with a bulldozer. He literally said, "Jesus, that root system was probably holding half this slope together." Important detail there, by the way, because my property sat slightly elevated compared to Grant's driveway. The cedar roots stabilized the soil whenever we got heavy rain. And remember that little fact, because nature was about to become my favorite witness. The estimate finally came in by email that Friday afternoon. I opened the PDF and honestly, even I had to sit down for a second. The replacement cost for mature 12 to 15-foot cedars, crane installation, soil restoration, irrigation repair, transport, and a 3-year survival warranty came out just north of $38,000. Yeah, 38 grand. For trees Grant called ugly. I printed the estimate and walked it over to his house personally because some numbers deserve face-to-face delivery. He opened the door smiling at first, until he saw the paperwork. Then his whole expression changed. His eyes scanned the page faster and faster before he actually laughed out loud. "This is insane," he said. "No tree costs $38,000. I said, They do when you destroy someone else's. He stepped outside, papers shaking in his hand now. I'm not paying this. Okay, I said. Then the lawyers can explain it to you. That's when the tough guy act started cracking a little. You could see it happening in real time. Guys like Grant love control right up until official paperwork enters the room. Suddenly, they start realizing confidence isn't evidence. He started backpedaling immediately. Come on, man, we're neighbors. Funny how people discover community values right after causing property damage. But honestly, I still wasn't even at the best part yet. Because while reviewing county ordinances that night, I found something beautiful. According to standard procedure in our city, removing a continuous natural barrier over a certain square footage required a minor land disturbance permit due to erosion concerns. Guess who definitely did not pull permits before bulldozing a root barrier out of a sloped property? Yeah. So Monday morning, I made one phone call to the city zoning office. And here's the thing. I didn't scream, threaten, or exaggerate anything. From a legal perspective, you never need drama when the paperwork already kills them for you. I simply explained that significant vegetation had been removed from a residential slope without visible erosion controls in place. That's it. The city inspector came out the very next afternoon. Grant looked absolutely confused seeing a county truck parked outside his house, while the inspector walked around taking pictures of exposed soil and muddy runoff trails. I watched the entire thing from my porch with a beer in my hand, like it was premium cable television. At one point, the inspector actually crouched down near the edge of the driveway and muttered, "Yeah, this is going to move during rain." You know that feeling when somebody else accidentally confirms you're right? Incredible feeling. By the end of the inspection, Grant got handed a compliance notice requiring temporary erosion control measures until the vegetation barrier was restored. 48 hours later, his pristine suburban dream yard had bright orange silt fencing stretched across the entire property line like a construction zone at a failed highway project. And man, the irony was delicious. The same guy who bulldozed my trees because they looked ugly now had industrial orange mesh barriers visible from 3 houses away. Neighbors started asking questions immediately. You could hear it happening in little suburban waves. Dog walkers slowing down. People pretending to check their mail longer than usual. One lady across the street literally asked me, "Are they building a retaining wall over there?" I just smiled and said, "Something like that." Grant, meanwhile, was unraveling. Every time I saw him outside, he looked more irritated than the last. The HOA even sent him a courtesy notice asking about the temporary fencing because apparently bright orange environmental barriers weren't part of the approved neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. Karma has a phenomenal sense of humor sometimes. Then came the rain. And this was the moment the entire situation turned from expensive into catastrophic. It started overnight, just a heavy spring storm rolling through around 2 a.m. Nothing apocalyptic, just steady rain for several hours. But without those cedar roots locking the soil together anymore, the slope started softening almost immediately. By morning, muddy runoff had slid directly toward Grant's driveway and into the decorative stone pavers he'd installed the previous summer, the same pavers he bragged about nonstop during neighborhood cookouts. Thick brown streaks covered the edges, and parts of the soil near the property line had started sinking unevenly. I heard him outside cursing before I even opened my blinds. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Grant looked scared. Not angry. Scared. Because now he finally understood the difference between landscaping and infrastructure. Those trees weren't decoration. They were functional. They held water, stabilized soil, reduced runoff, created wind resistance, protected privacy. 20 years of root development doesn't disappear cleanly because some guy rents a bulldozer for a weekend. Around sunset that same day, there was a knock at my front door. Grant stood there looking exhausted, soaked from the rain, hands shoved in his pockets. No confidence this time. No smug grin. Just stress. He goes, "What do you want me to do?" And honestly, I'd been waiting for that sentence all week. I kept my voice calm and said, "Full replacement. Mature cedars comparable to the originals. Professional installation. Soil stabilization. 3-year maintenance warranty. And written acknowledgement that you removed them without permission." He closed his eyes for a second like the words physically hurt him. "That's going to cost a fortune," he muttered. I nodded. "So does repairing erosion damage." Long silence after that. Rain dripping off the porch roof. You could practically hear the guy recalculating his life decisions in real time. Then finally, he said, "Fine." 2 weeks later, the neighborhood got a front row seat to the most expensive landscaping lesson of Grant Holloway's life. Flatbed trucks rolled in early Saturday morning, carrying massive burlap-wrapped cedar trees taller than most houses on the block. A full-crane crew showed up to lift them into position one at a time, while half the neighborhood watched from windows pretending they weren't completely invested. And I'll admit it, seeing those giant trees swing slowly through the air and settle back into the exact line where the originals once stood felt unbelievably satisfying. Better than yelling, better than court, better than revenge speeches. Just pure, documented accountability. By late afternoon, the new privacy wall stood even thicker than before, fresh dark mulch at the base, irrigation lines restored, soil compacted professionally. It looked incredible. Grant barely came outside during the installation. But once, toward the end, I saw him standing near his garage watching the final tree being lowered into place. And the expression on his face wasn't anger anymore. It was the look people get when they realize one impulsive decision turned into a problem they could have avoided completely by simply respecting boundaries in the first place. Looking back now, the weirdest part of this whole thing isn't even the money. It's how avoidable it all was. Grant could have knocked on my door months earlier and just had a normal conversation like an adult. We probably could have trimmed the side branches, adjusted the height a little, maybe even split the cost of maintenance. But that's not what he wanted. What he wanted was control. And honestly, that's what a lot of these neighborhood wars are really about underneath all the property lines and HOA emails and passive-aggressive lawn care. Ego. People convince themselves they're fixing something when really they just can't tolerate the idea that another person gets to make decisions they don't personally approve of. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere in suburban life. Somebody stares at the same fence, tree, parked truck, security camera, or basketball hoop long enough that eventually they stop seeing it as yours and start seeing it as a problem they're entitled to solve. And once entitlement mixes with certainty, people do incredibly stupid things with shocking confidence. The lesson here is simple. Boundaries only work when both people respect them. And I'm not just talking about property lines. I mean personal boundaries too. Respect, communication, patience, all the boring adult stuff people skip because they think being aggressive is faster. It usually isn't. According to standard procedure, almost every property dispute in America follows the same pattern. Somebody assumes, somebody escalates emotionally, and then paperwork enters the chat like a steel chair from the top rope. Surveys, permits, ordinances, insurance claims. Suddenly, the quick fix becomes a 5-figure disaster. From a legal perspective, Grant's biggest mistake wasn't bulldozing the trees. It was believing confidence mattered more than documentation. That's the part people never understand until it's too late. Reality doesn't care who sounds the most certain at the property line. It cares who has records. And honestly, I don't even hate the guy now. I really don't. Because by the end of it, I think he finally understood something important. Those trees were never the actual issue. The issue was respect. Funny enough, after the new cedars went in, the neighborhood got quieter. Grant stopped hovering around everybody else's property. HOA complaints mysteriously dropped off too. Maybe $38,000 bought him some self-awareness. Hard to say, but every once in a while I sit out on the porch in the evening, coffee in hand, staring at that thick green privacy wall swaying in the wind, and I think about how close this whole thing came to becoming an ugly legal war. Instead, it became a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't screaming, threatening, or getting even. Sometimes the best revenge is staying calm long enough to let consequences do the talking for you. And trust me, consequences speak fluent suburban.